thumbnail, not the.
Right. You can't. There's plenty of them. If you go on my YouTube, that like the first shot is like.
It's always you over there.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just
kind of good.
Right. Right. Exactly. So hopefully that's not as bad. So the Gilded Age. Do you might know what that means? Gilded Age. Gilded is an adjective that means gold-plated. Gilded, not golden age. Golden age is just golden all through and through. Gilded means gold-plated. A term given to this era years later by the writer Mark Twain, with whom I'm sure you're familiar. And what he meant is you could look at this time period in American history, which is from roughly the end of the Civil War into the early 20th century. So basically same time as Reconstruction and Redemption. And if you look at what is happening in America in terms of industrialization, what some would call a second industrial revolution, you look at that, but also at its negative consequences, then you see an America that is perhaps at a glance at certain elements of American society quite nice, golden on the outside. But you need only scratch through the surface and look here or there or elsewhere, and you see an America that's quite ugly. You see that America has industrialized very, very rapidly, very quickly, with very little thought given to the negative consequences of that industrialization. America's industrialized very quickly with little thought given to the negative consequences of that industrialization. So, for example, if we were to take a snapshot, a photograph, and dive into that as indicative of what America was like in this Gilded Age. The World's Fair held in Chicago during this period. They built an entire city within a city, a great white city of exhibition halls to show off all the latest and greatest in American industry and consumer products. And we have here in this photograph a fine Victorian-looking woman, a white woman, of course, overlooking the river and overlooking the great white city and these great exhibition halls and enjoying the comfort of an electric fan and so on. But you need only travel a few blocks in the city of Chicago, and even though this photograph represents New York City, you could still find tenements like this. Dilapidated, overcrowded apartment buildings filled with wage-earning workers, oftentimes immigrants, oftentimes in ghetto communities, living in structures that were built to no code whatsoever, working in factories that were the same, dirty, dangerous, no codes, no regulations, and so on, making wages that they could barely feed themselves on, much less a family. And so you see what Twain meant when he referred to this as a Gilded Age.
So basically it was good for those who had money.
Right. Good, you know, it's almost like we'll talk about they used to, historians used to refer to the 1920s sometimes as the Roaring Twenties, until you realize, well, it was only really roaring for a pretty small group of people. And when the Depression begins to set in, you know, for a lot of poor people, particularly, sharecroppers, it was not a whole lot different. So I think the same is true here. Well, let's have a little bit of context here and talk about the Industrial Revolution or revolutions. Some historians reject the idea that there's like a first or a second Industrial Revolution. And some hold on to the idea that what happens in America during this Gilded Age is significant enough to say, hey, this is something distinct. But industrialization, as I think we've at least alluded to in here, begins in England, or had begun in England in the 18th century with the advent of textile mills. Textile mills were the world's first factories, where you begin to see the process of mechanization of labor. The use of new machines to allow fewer people to do more work, like these looms here. Just a handful of people operating these gigantic looms, doing the work that it previously would have taken many, many people to do. And these people are working under one roof, under supervision. They're being paid wages by the hour. And those looms are being powered by something. Initially, that was water. So a swift running stream or a river would power the pulley system in those rafters that would allow those people to simply guide and supervise the work that the machine was doing to produce textiles, clothing, linens, etc. Using increasingly during that period, of course, cotton instead of wool. Remember, this is one of the factors that helped give rise to the Cotton Kingdom after Indian removal in the Deep South and the southern United States. Increase in demand in Britain with the rise of the textile industry. But eventually, and fairly quickly, that water power is replaced by steam power. The steam engine allows you to build these factories anywhere. You don't have to worry about a swift-moving stream or a river or whatever. You can build these factories anywhere in cities where in England at that time you had a large number of people seeking jobs, people who over the course of generations had been displaced from the land that their families had worked. And now they are in cities seeking jobs, and here's the wage work that they need. Around the same time, and I should pause and here say that there's a great historical debate as to why of all places would industrialization begin in England. You could pick half a dozen places where it would make more sense for this to have happened in the world than the island of Britain. But one answer to that is that the island of Britain is blessed with certain mineral resources. First of all, do you happen to know those steam engines, how do they produce the steam that turns the turbines that creates energy?
I want to say coal.
That is correct. They burn coal, or coke, a super concentrated form of that. And England is blessed with an abundance of coal, right? And at some point, you get coal out of coal mines, out of the ground, and they created this, pulley system. We had a cart that would go along a track into the coal mines that was pulled by a draft animal, like a mule or something, right? And of course, the mule would get coal dust in its lungs and die, and you'd have to replace it, and it's very sad. But some bright individual decided, what if we replace the damn animal with a steam engine? We put the steam engine in front of the cart. And the idea of the locomotive is born, the iron horse. And you eventually realize you could use this steam engine powered cart. You could enlarge it to something much bigger. You could build these railroad lines connecting not just a coal mine to the outside world, but Liverpool to Manchester to London. And you could transport more than just coal, all kinds of goods and people too. And the idea of the railroad is born, the birth of the locomotive. And I called it the iron horse. That's another thing that England is blessed with, an abundance of iron ore. So think about these characteristics of the first industrial revolution. Birth of the textile industry, first factories, wage work for the first time, the steam engine, birth of the locomotive and the railroad. Is that all making sense? Of course, these elements make their way across the Atlantic and take root at least in the northern part of the United States. And it spreads to other parts of Europe as well. But what begins to happen after the American Civil War, industrialization increases specifically in America, and there are certain developments in America, new characteristics we could look at to the point that some scholars will refer to this period as a second industrial revolution, where we're looking at changes in America not occurring first in Britain. Does that make sense? And I want to pause here and give you a sort of base definition of industrialization that I could have given you, probably maybe should have given you before we discussed the first. But we're, of course, more concerned here with the second anyway. And I'll go through it and we'll fill it in with some examples. But it's, so industrialization involves the application of new technologies, and scientific research, to industrial production or manufacturing. So don't just tell me, hey, it's all about, new scientific research and new technologies. It's about the application of those to industrial production or to manufacturing, to the making of things. Using new scientific research in the making of things. Using new technology in the making of things. Industrial production, manufacturing. So if we were going to look back and apply that to first industrial revolution, you would say, okay, new technologies would include these looms, right? New technologies would include the steam engine, right? New technologies would include the locomotive or the iron horse, yeah. Scientific research into the uses of iron ore or coal and so on. But let's look at that definition as it would apply to the second industrial revolution in the United States during this Gilded Age period. Let's say if you were to fast forward beyond the end of this period and into the early 20th century America to something we'll look at after the midterm, the rise of the automobile industry in America. You would go to Dearborn, Michigan, and the gigantic Ford Motor Company's Rouge Auto plant with this massive assembly line, pumping out thousands of cars a day, with men stationed along that line doing the same job over and over. What I'm getting at here is what is powering the heavy machinery on that assembly line? Because it's not a steam engine anymore. And it's damn sure not a water wheel. Electricity. Y'all know the story of Ben Franklin and electricity?
When
Yeah.
a thunderstorm, he tied a key to the string of the kite. When the lightning struck the kite, it was sent power through the key.
Yeah, so Ben Franklin is this jack of all trades, and there's this story of supposedly he goes out with his son, and there's a key tied to the kite, and they fly it in a lightning storm, and it gets struck by lightning, and they're, electricity, right?
And helped inspire his creation of the lightning rod that kept tossing him and struck the lightning.
Absolutely. Brilliant guy, Ben Franklin. But it's one thing to say, okay, Ben Franklin, quote unquote, discovered electricity. Okay, his kite and his lightning rod would get struck by lightning, and it's like, okay, that's electricity, we get it. But what do you do with it? And two, would you just have to wait around for a lightning storm to have it or to observe it, right? Or to channel it into something? So the point here is, regardless of what we credit Ben Franklin with, it's not until this period that someone figures out how to generate electricity and to put it to use. The electric motor is the key invention here. Electric motor and being able to generate electricity and to use it to power machines. So if we say new technologies and scientific research applied to industrial production, the electric motor places the steam engine in manufacturing. Now, if we're to talk about like steam engine powering ships, like steamships, replacing sailing vessels and other modes of transportation, well, eventually you could talk about, if we carry this forth into the 20th century, the internal combustion engine, which would eventually run the automobile. Going back to our definition of scientific research, specifically into chemical processes. So you could add that as an addendum. Scientific research into chemical processes. Here during the Second Industrial Revolution, we'd be looking specifically at two things. The refining of oil, crude oil, and the production of steel. Refining of oil and the production of steel. So if you're going to fill in that base definition with new technologies and scientific research, you're talking about the electric motor, later the internal combustion engine, you're looking at the production of steel and the refining of crude oil. And finally, a massive growth in America's railroad network, what you might call a transportation revolution, which is accompanied by a communications revolution with the growth of America's telegraph network. Everywhere the railroad goes, so goes the telegraph. These things make the American continent not so enormous, and they make transportation and communication much more efficient. Note that neither of these things is invented during the Second Industrial Revolution. They were around. They are elements of the first. But America's railroad and telegraph networks grow dramatically during this period, such that historians will refer to this time as having experienced a communications and transportation revolution. Is that all clear? Questions? Well, with industrialization comes the growth of cities. Factories are going to be located in cities. That's where the workers are that are needing the wage work that will populate these factories and meat packing plants and everything else. So not only do you have tremendous population growth in America during this period, you have specifically urbanization, which is the growth of cities. By the end of this period, more people in America will live in cities than in rural areas or farming communities or whatever. By the end of this period, most Americans will live in cities. And America's population growth during this period is not fully attributable just to natural increase. You have a substantial uptick in immigration during this period. And when immigrants in this period move to America, they're moving to cities. It's not like in the 18th century when we took a snapshot of immigration at the different regions of the colonies prior to the Revolution, and it was mostly small farmers coming over. No, immigrants are moving to America during this period. They're moving to cities, and they're getting wage-earning, typically factory-type jobs. And they're coming from different parts of the world, too. This is not like, again, harkening back to that 18th century colonial lecture where we see a lot of Irish and Scots-Irish and German and, of course, Africans via the slave trade. It's not that you don't continue to see people from those places, but if you were to single out like the largest number of immigrants come from fill in the blank, where would they be coming from during this period? And I should say they often settle by some combination of choice and compulsion into what would have been called ghetto community. The original use of ghetto is an immigrant, ethnically identifiable neighborhood in a city. So if we're looking at New York City, where do you think these folks are coming from?
The Caribbean.
Say it
I
again.
want to say like the Caribbean.
Yes, yeah, and that's a really good.
Like South America and stuff.
We're a little bit out in front of that. That's coming. And that's really tremendously important, especially a lot of work that's been done very recently on, the complexion of Black America is to say, not everyone who's Black in America is descended of someone who was a slave. We have these waves of migration, from Africa post-slavery, from the Caribbean, and then yes, too, we have a tremendous amount of Latin American migration in the 20th century. We're just before that, though. So you're looking at a lot of Southern and Eastern Europeans. So Italians would make up a big chunk of immigrants to places like New York City or Philadelphia. And you would have like a Little Italy neighborhood, right? Where all the Italian immigrants live. You would have a lot of Polish immigrants, for example. And there'd be a Polish quarter in the city. What about, let's not just stay in New York City. What about San Francisco? That's on the other side of America, huh?
Well, they would be coming from like Asia and stuff.
Right. Chinese. Substantial number of immigrants from China during this period. And so if you have, and this actually goes for New York City too, where all the Chinese immigrants, so that's Chinatown, right? You have little Chinatown communities in New York City or San Francisco or whatever, right? Well, regardless of whether you're talking about a San Francisco or a New York or a Chicago, and especially Chicago, cities are growing during this period, and they're growing up, they're growing out. They're growing up in terms of getting crowded, especially in downtown areas where real estate is at a premium. You begin to see the first skyscrapers emerge. Super tall, for the time, buildings. It's not that cities hadn't been crowded before and that no one had ever thought about building taller buildings. It's just given building materials and architecture and techniques up to this point, if you wanted to have a building that was taller than, say, this, because all of the weight rests upon the foundation, you needed to have wider walls or a wider base. You think about what, for a long time in world history, were the tallest structures in the world in Northeast Africa. The pyramids of Egypt. Wide-ass base, right? Not feasible in downtown area, particularly if you've ever been to Chicago. Chicago is this great sprawling city, but the downtown area, the loop, is quite small. So it's not feasible to have these giant wide bases just to build buildings taller. So what the key breakthrough here is the steel frame. And I talked about scientific research into chemical processes like the production of steel. Don't tell me that steel was invented during this period. What could we point to and say, well, steel's been around for hundreds of years? And actually, I would have to point to you in my world class because I don't think we covered it in here. How's that for being put on the spot? If we looked at the Spanish conquest of the Americas, Spanish conquistadors and their armies had steel weapons and armor, in the 16th century. The breakthrough is not the invention of steel, it is the efficient production of steel. Make it cheaper. So that it was something feasible that you could use in building a skyscraper. So look at this. With the steel frame, the entire weight of the building doesn't rest on the base. It hangs off the steel skeleton, if you will, at every level, right? It's distributed throughout. And I use that metaphor of a skeleton quite deliberately, right? Our entire weight is not actually supported by, every ounce of our flesh is not supported by the soles of our feet, right? So.
Is that one of the reasons they like get destroyed so easily? Because like you take out one steel beam, like all the floors are like disconnected.
Yeah, and if you consider what happened on 9/11, I think part of that tragedy is that the jet fuel was enough to melt the steel. Steel, needless to say, steel doesn't melt easily. But if you get it to a point where it is melting and one floor collapses, then yeah, the whole damn building is going to come down. But otherwise, they're incredibly durable, and the ones that are super tall, and today they are, if you go to a place like Dubai or to the eastern coastal cities of China, there are some incredible skyscrapers. But even ones that are not nearly that tall, they're designed to sway in the wind and not to be perfectly rigid, you know. And it's incredible sight to behold. But the earliest ones are not quite so impressive. So let's transport ourselves back to the Gilded Age and understand how this is a breakthrough. This one architect in Chicago, Sullivan, designs this type of building. Typically, it's a kind of a three-form building. You have an elaborate base, maybe with some classical Greco-Roman looking type architecture columns. A very simple body, and then maybe some elaborate adornment on the top. And, you know, could be a 20, 30 story tall building. Again, maybe not impressive to us, but significant for the day and time. And it's not just the steel frame that makes this possible, by the way. You have to have the invention of the elevator, you have to have central heating of some sort, you have to have a water pump system, and so on. Other innovations would play a role in this. But this becomes the Chicago style and the Sullivan style, and you see those buildings pop up all throughout the biggest cities of America, from New York to San Francisco to Philadelphia to Boston and to this city here. It's none of the ones I just mentioned. What's that? It's not just a rendering. I mean, it's a rendering of a real place. Looking roughly southeast, I think. And consider that,
Charleston or Atlanta?
I think I heard it. Consider that if you look at, you can't see all the streets coming into this intersection, but if you could, you would see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points.
Atlanta.
Yeah, and today there will be a Walgreens here and a giant round Coca-Cola sign. And then this, if you guys transfer downtown, that is the Hurt building, which is right across, catty corner from the Langdale Hall classroom building. You will almost assuredly take classes in Langdale. It is directly across from what used to be Kell Hall, which is a former parking garage they converted into a classroom building, which fortunately for you is no longer a classroom building. It's been torn down. But anyway, yeah, this is downtown Atlanta.
Is that kind of like where the railroads used to meet, like the hub junctions of the 5 incoming roads?
Yeah, the major railroad line in the depot is where Underground is today. And so that would be like just a block or two down this one, yeah. And then the 5 Points MARTA station is right there, and so yeah, that's kind of ground zero, if you will. Today, everything right here over, that's Woodruff Park. So none of these buildings are there. Her building is still there. There are 3 or so other Sullivan-style era buildings in Atlanta downtown. This is the view looking from, like we just looked at where the Coca-Cola sign would be in the Walgreens. This would be like if you were looking from that perspective north, up Peachtree Street. So all of this today is Woodruff Park. Over here are office buildings, one of which used to be mine when I was downtown. I was on like the 30th floor of a shitty old 1960s office building. That, though, is the Candler building, Asa Candler of Coca-Cola fame. This is another Sullivan era style skyscraper. What else do you see here, though? And this is probably from well into the 20th century.
Like the showways, kind of like the early bus.
Yeah.
Cars.
Yeah. So the skyscrapers in Atlanta date to around the 1900s, by 1910 or so. But here, if you get into the 1910s and 20s, you've got streetcars, which are powered by electricity, by the way. And you've got automobiles. Doesn't appear to be a whole lot of traffic control. It's kind of chaotic. Have people walking to and fro, maybe not the safest place. Which is important to note, one of the things about the Gilded Age, no regulations. And kind of eventually a slap in the face that we need some regulations, in this case of roadways, thoroughfares, streetways. What else do you see here?
Ooh, street lights.
Streetlights, electric light. Thomas Edison not only invents the incandescent light bulb, but later partners with investors like the financier J.P. Morgan to build power plants and electrify cities, beginning in Manhattan and New York City, and eventually every major city in America. But not just to power the streets, but eventually the buildings and the homes too. So this is that same look if we were to take a step back. This is before the Walgreens here. But that's the Camel building. Nowadays dwarfed by these more modern skyscrapers. That's my old building. 191 Peachtree, Georgia Pacific. What is now the Georgia's own credit union building. That's a GSU building over here. That was also my building for a while. That's LG's building now. This is a close-up of the Hurt building. And there's Kell Hall, which no longer exists. But you can see more clearly the sort of tripartite style, right? The sort of classical style base. Almost what would later become Art Deco. Main portion, if you will, of the building, and then some elaborate adornment, which you can't really see all that well in this image. LG's going to love that I incorporated Google Earth into the slideshow. But yeah, in terms of growing out, what I mean is the streetcar system allows cities to grow out, and you see the development of the first suburbs, or what would have been considered suburbs then, what we would consider like in-town neighborhoods now. So if we're talking about Atlanta, you're talking about like Inman Park or West End. Which again, if you were going down into town and going to Inman Park, you'd be like, yeah, I'm gonna go downtown. But back then, this is a neighborhood removed from downtown, which wealthy people could escape the hustle and bustle, have a nice home that's outside of downtown, and you could ride the streetcar in and out of town, right? Or later, if you could afford an automobile. We talked about the advent of electricity and electrifying cities. Also, cities get nasty. If we were to go back to the last time we looked at urbanization and growth of cities, that's a period in which, if you're talking about human waste, this is the day of outhouses and chamber pots, right? And you just dump that shit out somewhere, and it was all good because the roaming pigs of the neighborhood would clean it up for you. It's all good. Pigs will eat anything.
I found that weird candy because they poured it out on it.
I know, right?
I had to look it up, and I was like,
That's exactly what they did. Yeah.
Down the street.
That's the thing, and that's Paris of that day, and in Paris of that day, roaming.
So you walk in the middle.
Yeah, that's right. Don't walk on the outside. Needless to say, that doesn't hold up if you're going to have cities that get this big. So they had to develop, beginning in cities like London and Paris, and eventually in cities like Boston and New York and Chicago. First, sewage diversion systems. I think in London, all they did at the first is, we're going to have a sewage system. We're going to channel this human waste. We're going to send it in pipes down the Thames River and dump it back in the river to where it's somebody else's problem. But what we're talking about here, remember, is scientific research into chemical processes like waste treatment. So what we figure out here in America is how to treat that waste to where it's not toxic anymore to the environment, and then you can reintroduce it in the water system. So sewage treatment is key, not just diversion. But that allows cities to grow without being, hubs of human pestilence due to waste, right? Let's talk about those revolutions in transportation and communication then. By the end of this period, America will have far and away the largest railroad network in the world. It was England that led the way. England had for a time the world's largest railroad network, but of course the United States is far larger than England. And once you have the dramatic growth, as you can see if you look at this map, of America's railroad network in the Northeast and the Midwest, to a lesser extent in the South, but eventually transcontinental and into the West, America will far surpass England or anyone else. Of course, it's highly concentrated in the old manufacturing centers of the Northeast, where Boston is, where New York City is, where Philadelphia is, the nation's capital, Washington and Baltimore, which connect to the cities of the Midwest, Pittsburgh, Cleveland and Cincinnati, Akron, Indianapolis, Detroit, which would become the hub of America's auto industry. And out here, on the edges of the Great Plains, America's great breadbasket and wheat production, you had cities like Topeka, Kansas, and Lincoln, Nebraska, and Kansas City, Missouri, and St. Louis, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and none greater than Chicago. Chicago is the great hub city of this entire region. What I mean by a hub city, I mean Chicago, through the railroad and telegraph networks, is connected to those smaller cities, but nonetheless big cities like Topeka and Lincoln and Minneapolis and Indianapolis and St. Louis and so on. Those cities are connected to smaller cities and towns, which are connected to America's hinterland or farmland. And what you end up with is an environment in which the railroads allow some farmer in Kansas to send his wheat and his livestock via the railroad, eventually perhaps even all the way to Chicago, where his livestock could be slaughtered in the pens in Chicago and processed in a meatpacking plant there or in Cleveland somewhere and shipped back out of that city as, canned meat, or even on a refrigerated railroad car as refrigerated meat. And those grains that he had shipped into some grain elevator operation between him and Topeka had been separated out in a grade A, B, and C, put on a railroad that goes to Chicago, where some of it might be shipped back out on the railroads, back into those same cities and small towns as Kellogg's cornflakes or so-and-so's granola bars, right? Processed foods. Beginnings of processed foods and the complete separation of most Americans from the process of creating your own food. How many people do you know slaughter their own livestock? Maybe you know some. How many people take their own grains and make granola or cereal or whatever out of them? Okay, fair enough. But that's like a hip thing to do, probably. That's not maybe what they do to survive. And it's not just processed foods. You could get, if you're that same farmer in Kansas, you could get in your mail the Montgomery Ward catalog or the Sears and Roebuck catalog and flip through the pages and see all kinds of new manufactured goods, especially if you had electricity in your home. And you see you could order from Montgomery & Ward or Sears and Roebuck everything from a new sewing machine to, you know, baseball bat and glove for your kid, or Pear's soap, apparently. My favorite, and I don't know that I have them in this slideshow, are like the snake oil type products. You never heard of the snake oil salesman? Well, there are no regulations of like what we consider medicine or drug industry, so people could sell all kinds of shit that they claim did stuff. So I'd be the guy going to the snake oil salesman and be like, oh, tell me about this reducing soap that reduces your fat just by using the soap. Like I can just rub this soap on my gut and it's gone. So, you know, all kinds of crazy products that you can simply order it through these catalogs, through the mail, and they're shipped back out by the railroad and delivered to your door. It's the equivalent for what is in our day and time, this revolution that is like Amazon, right? And other things where we could just get on our phone, order something, and it's at our door a few days later. Needless to say, it wasn't quite that easy then, but I'm saying for these people, the advent of mail order, you know, manufactured goods probably felt to them like that feels to us. Does that make sense? And it's all possible because of the railroad and because of the telegraph. If I didn't mention how the telegraph works, how does the telegraph work? Here's another use for electricity, and not just Franklin saying, you know, there it is.
It's almost like Morse code, and they tap like this little switch, and it'll send like beeps to another telegraph over these through electric wires that connect them.
That's it. That's exactly right. So you would have a company like especially Western Union that would have offices in every city and multiple in cities in every small town where people could go, and a telegraph officer would be able to take a message, a telegram that you wanted to send to someone in some other city or town, right? And they would translate that message into Morse code, the system of dots and dashes, which you would have a little tapper, and you'd hold longer for a dash than a dot. And every letter corresponds to some combination of dots and dashes. And it's an electrical signal going out over the wire, right? Copper wire. And that will go to whatever other office, and you would have another officer there who would decode that, you know, type out the message, and then deliver it to whomever it was to be delivered to, right? The significance of this is not just, man, you know, I really want to get word to my buddy, I'm in Chicago, and I want to get word to him that I'm coming to Cincinnati. Think about, for example, someone invents a ticker that would utilize telegraph technology to tick out in real time, and your home or your business or wherever, the value of stocks on the New York Stock Exchange. So that you could make an informed investment sitting in Chicago in some corporation that sells its stock on the New York Stock Exchange in Manhattan, right? You could invest in the futures of a value of quantity of oranges in Florida, having never set foot in Florida, or never would set foot in Florida, or never lay eyes on the oranges themselves. And you turn around and sell them the next day for a profit if it went up. So the telegraph makes possible the advent of the stock market and the growth of American corporations. And by the end of this period, we have entered into the age of corporate America, no doubt. And America has taken a step forward as a consumer culture. Do you remember how I defined consumer culture as opposed to a producer culture? So a society in which people purchase the daily necessities of life. That's what it means to be a consumer in the economic sense. We purchase, we buy the daily necessities of life. We don't produce for ourselves the clothes on our back or our food that we eat, as I was mentioning earlier. So how do we take a step forward here as a consumer culture? Well, consider that definition, the necessities, the things you need. Here, corporations, through marketing and advertising, want to convince you that your needs are endless. That you need fill in the blank manufactured good or consumer product. You need Kellogg's Corn Flakes in your pantry. You need Pear's soap. You need Heinz baked beans in your cabinet. You need Campbell's soup, and so on. You need that new sewing machine for your house. I want to convince you that your needs are endless, unfulfilled, and can only be filled by the purchasing of more things. Does that make sense? Well, what about steel and oil? What is steel anyway?
It's a mixture of different metals. It's a homogeneous mixture of different metals because it's the same throughout.
Right. Steel is not something that you just go and say, I'm going to dig in the ground and I'm going to dig me up some steel, right? Steel is an alloy. Iron and carbon and a mixture of other metals. So to produce good steel, it would not only need to be like a perfect ratio of iron to carbon, but it almost be like a perfect cocktail with other elements thrown in there, whether it be aluminum or zinc or magnesium or whatever. And I'm certainly no scientist, and so as not to embarrass myself, particularly given that LG is watching these videos, my buddy, I'm going to keep it real simple. Again, know that human beings have been making steel for centuries up to this point, right? But it's an expensive and difficult process, and it's therefore an expensive product. And it would have been unfeasible prior to this time to use steel in building, for example. But a man named Bessemer discovers a much more efficient way of producing steel. Again, to try to keep it real simple for mostly my own purposes, the production of steel would have to go through numerous steps prior to this. So you would have to melt down the iron ore. It becomes pig iron, which is not of much use. Too many impurities, carbon content's not right. And so you would smelt that or melt it down again and turn it into wrought iron, W-R-O-U-G-H-T. You ever heard of wrought iron? When I was growing up, it was, I guess, fashionable to have wrought iron patio furniture. Or like a wrought iron lamp fixture or something. So,
is that just to lower the cost of production?
Yeah, I mean, it's fine if it's supporting, my fat ass sitting out on a patio, but it's not, wrought iron is not useful in building. It's not strong enough, it's not durable. You know what I mean? So if we're talking about aesthetics, wrought iron, cool, to have this kind of industrial-like look, right? But, in fact, let's just so I'm not telling tales outside of school.
So basically it's like plastic wood, not as efficient, but like wood system.
Let's have a look. Yeah, that's sort of a classic. You've seen like that, right? And that would be, this is a little more, it doesn't have to always be elaborate. This is pretty simple, right? Oh, that doesn't help. Well, I don't know. That actually does help my point. Yeah, if it is expensive. But the point is you would have to go through that process again where you would melt that down yet again. You would remove any impurities, and you would then add in those elements that you thought would make it stronger and more durable, and then you would have steel, right? What Bessemer figures out is a way to go, in essence, directly from pig iron to steel. And I'm to understand the magic happens here in this bulbous vessel where you blow oxygen into the molten pig iron to remove impurities and so on. And if you want to more fully understand it, you could walk your way through these various steps of this diagram, but I'm just going to leave it at that. For you, the thing to know is that Henry Bessemer figures out a much more efficient way to produce steel that makes steel cheaper and that makes it of use in building skyscrapers and bridges and other infrastructure. And needless to say, a lot of people make a lot of money in the steel industry. There are steel towns that become great hubs of the steel industry. For example, there are abundant iron ore deposits in western Pennsylvania. And what's the great steel town of the Midwest up there in western PA? I mean, the football team are called the Steelers for a reason. Pittsburgh. In the South, there is a town that didn't even exist prior to the late 1800s that comes into being somewhat akin to Atlanta as a railroad junction, but more importantly because of the abundance of iron ore deposits in the foothills surrounding this town. And it becomes the so-called Magic City because it pops up out of nowhere, and by 1900 it's this big city that rivals maybe for a small time the city of Atlanta because of its steel industry. Birmingham, Alabama is a steel town. Interestingly, western PA is also where oil is first discovered in America. We tend to think of oil and think about like Texas and the American West, but the first abundance of crude oil found in the ground in America was in western Pennsylvania and Ohio, and this is where individuals like John Rockefeller come to power and prominence in the oil industry. I mentioned chemical processes, not just the Bessemer process and the production of steel. What about the refining of oil? Crude oil as it comes out of the ground is not of much use. But I don't have to tell you that oil is extraordinarily valuable. Because if you refine it, that is, if you heat it up and separate it out into its constituent parts, from vapors and then thin liquids to thicker liquids down to sludgy stuff at the bottom, and then you figure out over time what you could do to each of those constituent parts to refine them further, to make them useful in some way. And all of a sudden you go from something that's not of much use to something that has a myriad of uses. What all do we get out of crude oil? So when I mentioned John Rockefeller, he's a guy, a ruthless bastard who makes a fortune by being a ruthless bastard in the oil industry that gets to kind of make his fortune at least twice. You might even say at least 3 times. First, let's say beginnings of the Gilded Age, maybe even Civil War era, before electric light, before power plants and the electrification of cities. What gave light to street lamps and light in people's homes? Not just candles, but what? What did you say? Yeah, you burn a fire in the house, of course, and have some candles going.
Burn oil.
Right, kerosene. Kerosene is a byproduct of the refining of oil. Kerosene would burn lamps, like street lamps or lamps you would have in your home or business, right? So Rockefeller makes a fortune off oil, due in large part early on, or in large part thanks to kerosene, the ubiquity of kerosene. What happens then when electric light replaces kerosene lamps? You think, oh no, Rockefeller is going to lose his fortune and oil is going to be irrelevant. Well, consider they had scientists at work trying to figure out what could they do with these other constituent parts. In particular, there was this highly flammable liquid coming off the middle there that they were just throwing away that they didn't know what to do with it. It's so highly combustible. What are you going to do with it? Well, it just so happens that scientists were at the same time working to develop an internal combustion engine and simply couldn't find the right fuel for it. And some bright individual realizes, hey, take this shit and use it. And gasoline becomes the power for the internal combustion engine, which of course becomes the motor for the automobile. And John Rockefeller gets to make his fortune all over again thanks to gasoline. And what do we use to lubricate the engines in our cars? What we just call oil, which is motor oil, which is a lubricant for the engine. So it doesn't, overheat and melt all of its metal parts together, right? So motor oil and gasoline. What else? What if you go home tonight, you're going to watch the NLCS, you're going to watch the Braves take on the Dodgers, you're going to go out and grill, you know, and you don't like charcoal, so you got the gas grill, and maybe you want to light up whatever it is you smoke while you're out there. What else is out there? What do you got in the grill? What do you got in the lighter? Propane in the grill, butane in the lighter. Both of these are up here on the vapor end. So these are byproducts of crude oil refining: propane, butane. What else? Later, diesel fuel, jet fuel, sure. Down here, industrial fuel, asphalt base, the base of what would become the building of roads for automobiles in America, asphalt. I don't think it's on here, but the source material for various plastics, and look all around you at any given moment, plastic is everywhere. All of these byproducts of the refining of crude oil. And then you have an individual like Rockefeller who uses business strategies that we would maybe refer to as vertical integration, that is having your company own the land where the crude oil is, own the rigs that get it out of the ground, own the refineries where it's refined, own everything that it's shipped in, and so on, so you control the product from beginning to end. And then Rockefeller also engages in horizontal integration, where he, through various dirty, nefarious practices, muscles competitors out of business and overtakes them, buys them out. So he owns all the refineries, or he owns all the oil fields, and pretty soon Rockefeller has very nearly monopolized the oil industry. And remember what we said about monopolies and mercantilism are useful, but monopolies and capitalism are bad. Why? If you have one company or one individual who controls an entire industry, why is this bad? Bad for us, the consumer, because when there is no competition, you can charge whatever you want, especially if it's something vital like oil. You charge whatever the hell you want. Imagine if Apple was the only company that made smartphones, and we've gotten to the point where we just have to have these things. It's already expensive enough. Imagine if they could double or triple that price. What are you going to do? No competition. And so what will eventually happen, as we'll see in a later lecture, the government goes after Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company to become this monster with its tentacles and everything from the State House to Washington and so on, and forces it to break up into competing companies. So large was Standard Oil that among the competing companies that are created, when it's broken up, when it's split up, just from memory here, Chevron, Exxon, Mobil, Amoco, Conoco, Sunoco. I mean, all those are now multi-billion-dollar corporations. And speaking of corporations, Standard Oil is a transitional figure. If you were to look at someone like Andrew Carnegie, who builds an empire in the steel industry and builds this massive company that's ultimately bought out by someone else, J.P. Morgan, but that was his company. He owned the company, right? He's the proprietor that owns the company. Think about a massive corporation nowadays. I mentioned Apple and a good Auburn guy, Tim Cook, who runs that company. He's the CEO, I think, Chief Executive Officer. Does Tim Cook own Apple? Who owns Apple? Shareholders, stockholders, right? It is a publicly traded company. And yes, Cook and a small number of individuals on a board of trustees, they own a shitload of stock in it, right? They own a controlling amount of stock where they can, put someone into a position of CEO or CFO or COO or whatever to actually run the company. But it is technically publicly traded and owned by the individuals who own stock in it, right? That's the essence of a corporation. Standard Oil is transitional. It was Rockefeller's among the first to create that trust, a board of trustees or entrusted with running the company that own some percentage of the company that you can then see that transition into, we talk about, or I mentioned rather, J.P. Morgan buying out Carnegie's steel company. That will become U.S. Steel, which will become the first billion-dollar publicly traded corporation in American history that is not owned by J.P. Morgan. It is owned by shareholders. And remember, that's facilitated by the stock exchange, which itself, the growth of is facilitated by growth of America's telegraph network and so on. All that makes sense? We'll have to stop there, and I guess what I will do is take the remaining portion of this lecture and tack it on to the progressive era lecture so that you will not have to worry about the rest of this lecture for the midterm. Everybody make note of that. Content for this exam stops right here. I'll throw the rest of this on to the beginning of the next one after the midterm. Hopefully everybody here has got that as well, right?